Yeah, tēnā koutou, I'm Selwyn Manning and welcome to A View from Afar. And today, in this, the 12th episode of A View from Afar for 2023, political scientist Dr. Paul Buchanan and I will note and discuss some of the big world events that have occurred and are occurring in 2023. And in particular, Paul and I will discuss the rise of the global south. We'll evaluate the wars that continue to rage in Ukraine and Gaza, and tensions also in the South China Sea. Plus, we will note, with particular reference to trends that will become prominent in 2024, including the decline of Western democracies and what we're observing as witnesses at the moment in countries like Argentina and New Zealand, a rightward turn in many places. And then we can expect that trend to perhaps cement itself as we go forward into the new year. Before we cross to Paul, here's an invitation to our live audiences. Feel free to interact with us while live via YouTube, and if you do so, you'll be able to engage with you, and we will be able to engage with you in this program. But remember, if you do make comments or lodge questions, your interaction may be included in this broadcast. So let's cross to Paul and unpack some of the complexities of 2023 and also position ourselves for 2024 in our thinking on geopolitics and global issues. Crossing to Paul now. Tēnā koe eho. Good to see you, Paul. How is it going with you?
Kia ora, Selwyn. Yeah, it's I can't get out of 2023 fast enough as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, for many, I'd say, yeah.
Yeah, I'm not alone in that. I was noticing that, and some correspondence I had, people on the other side of the world are also like so over 2023. We have our own reasons, but certainly it's a global trend. It's been a tough year politically. It's been a terrible year in my opinion. But we can only look to the future and hope that this is the low ebb and things will improve from here, starting with the incoming year. You know what I thought I'd do, and we can just back and forth on this. Let's sort of summarize each of us, what the general trend was for 2023.
Yeah.
And then, just interject and I'll back and forth with you. I'll tell you, for me, the big issue of this past year has been something we've talked about in the past, but it's really come home in 2023, which is this whole idea of systemic realignment. The global south has made its entrance. It's made its entrance on the backs of two conflicts, the Ukraine-Russia war and now the Hamas-Israel war, have been sort of like precipitants or triggering events that have brought, if you will, the contradictions between the post-colonial South and the post-imperial North. And these two conflicts are showing that divide starkly. And on top of that, and running in parallel but overlapped, are the fact that now the so called BRICS are reconvening and are expanding. You may recall that Argentina,
January.
Egypt, January 1st, Argentina, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Yemen, for some reason, interestingly, will become members of the BRICS. They are proposing to create a common currency to rival the euro. That may take a few years, but they appear to be at least attempting to overcome their own internal contradictions in an effort to establish themselves as a bloc that can rival, in first instance, the eurozone, the EU in particular, and maybe down the road form some sort of military constellation. We've used this word in the past.
Because just for the audience's benefit, what we're talking about here with the BRICS is the Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa expanding, and also it's been an economic bloc, hasn't it? And it's been the genesis, the nucleus of the genesis of trade relationships and things like that, which expanded obviously under those types of principles to many countries, including in the ASEAN nations and New Zealand included. So what we're talking about here and what Paul's identifying is the likelihood that we could see, well, the opportunity is there for the BRIC states, should things continue in the current trend, to become a security type of element to it as well. So that's interesting. Just from some of the audience's point of view, Paul, because we've mentioned the global south and also the traditional references to the north and the south in some ways. And I know that some academics in Germany kind of shun away from the global south, but they haven't got a name that can replace what they're talking about, so they go with it and grit their teeth. Can you define the global south for those that are a little bit unsure on exactly what we're talking about here?
Yeah, it'd be a pleasure to do so. But the global south is not a geographic construct. What it is more of an ideological construct. If you think a way of seeing the world. And that's why I call it post-colonial, because most of these emerging nations, both in the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere, have been subject to colonialism at some point in their national histories. And that has marked them in a way that I think a lot of Westerners don't understand. That's the key point. We've talked in the past about, why has most of Africa, most of Latin America, most of Central and Southeast Asia have not joined the sanctions regime against the Russians. This seems to be very much a NATO Anglophone sanctions regime. And that's because of their post-colonial memories. Again, we've talked about this, but the Russians supported liberation movements against dictators backed by the West, supported liberation movements and national independence movements against former colonies. If you think of Angola and Mozambique, former Portuguese colonies that were both revolutionary and fighting for independence at the point where they broke free. Well, the so-called third world, that would be another way to phrase it, but they're no longer third world in the sense of underdevelopment. They remember these things. And I would say that the global south includes countries like Indonesia, countries like Malaysia, obviously Pakistan, as well as India. I mean, these are significant countries. These are not
what were
small.
once considered by the United States administrations as the domino country threats of the expansion of internationalism, of communism, for example, in the 60s and early 1970s. So those are what you're talking about there with Indonesia and certainly Malaysia, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah.
Yeah, and again, they have their own view of the world. Which is not necessarily east and west, the way, again, the West tends to look at things. And it just so happened that in the past month, I've written a piece on South America. It was commissioned by the New Zealand, New Zealand International Review. And what was interesting in thinking, they said, go with whatever you want, just write this piece. And so, as I was sort of thinking about topics and everything, what became very clear is that although the United States treats Latin America or operates in Latin America from the perspective of the 1823 Monroe Doctrine, which basically says that the U.S. will resist with force any attempt by our extra regional power to establish a military presence in the hemisphere. Well, China's gone ahead and ignored that. And it's almost as if it's daring the United States to invoke this obsolescent doctrine. It's not even a treaty or anything, it's just a doctrine. The Chinese, it's almost, again, that they're thumbing their noses at the states because they have established six signals intelligence collection bases in South America in the past 5 to 10 years. They are proposing to establish a naval base in Ushuaia, which is down at the bottom of Tierra del Fuego, so they can project force across the Straits of Magellan onto the Antarctic. And the Yanks, all they're doing is barking. I mean, it's literally they're sitting on the porch and not running out with the big dogs. And I think, well, this is the mindset. It's not, the Americans are focused on the Chinese as a rival, but it's more of a South mindset. We are going to ignore the traditional masters, and we are going to make relationships that we see is in our benefit, whether or not the West, the post-imperial North, thinks it's good or not. And so China's been welcomed in South America. In fact, China is the biggest trading partner of South America. It overtook the United States 4 or 5 years ago. I think about 9 of the countries in the region are part of the Belt and Road Initiative. My point in saying all this is simply that the South Americans simply do not see the United States the way the United States sees itself. They see the United States as a declining power that is less significant to them economically than trade with China and the BRICS. And they don't fear the United States militarily because they know, having seen the United States at war for the last 20 years or so, that the United States has, it's still a formidable military, but the wars that it has fought, it has lost. Afghanistan, it retreated. In Iraq, it retreated.
With
it hasn't
chaos
gone
in its
well.
wake, in both of those cases. One of the things, so we've defined the global south, we've applied how we are witnessing the rise of the global south in different regions of the world. Let's have a look in the general region of the Middle East and North Africa. There's also a question that's come in from one of our friends here, Martin Bradbury, Bomber Bradbury, known to many, and I'll just bring it up on screen. And he's kind of hitting on this, and he's saying, comrades, and Bomber, I just want to say to you, because I know you're watching live, I remember an amazing, fascinating and funny episode of your program where you had Jerry Brownlee on and you referred to him as the host, you referred to Brownlee as comrade, and he absolutely erupted, and I just thought that was one of the best moments on a live broadcast that I'd seen. Back to the question. Now, Martin Bradbury, he says, comrades, is the new Western Naval Alliance in the Red Sea announced in the last 48 hours a first step toward wider conflict with Iran? Paul, I'll push this to you, and also perhaps with an extra thing is, are we seeing this in part of many pieces on the board in that conflict zone?
Yeah, well, first of all, Bomber, congratulations on the success of your show. You've done very well there, mate, and it's always good to hear from you. Interestingly enough, the U.S. is playing in to Hamas and Iran's hands by putting up this fleet to combat the Houthis. It's very clear that if the United States wanted to bomb the crap out of the Houthis, they could. But instead, they're going to try to run a picket line to ward them off from the commercial fleets that are passing through the straits. And that's exactly what Hamas wanted. Hamas wanted, and I should say the Iranians as well, to widen this into a bigger conflict. And they're in the process of doing so. We also have to recall that the Arab street is on Hamas's side, even if the oligarchs who run most of the Sunni Arab world are trying to straddle the fence or are quietly pro Israel. The street is clearly on Hamas's side, and what's remarkable about that is that the Arab street is Sunni, but Hamas is backed by Shia Iran. Hamas has Shia elements in it. It's Sunni majority, but there are Shiites fighting with it, and Hezbollah, of course, is a Shiite militia on the north of Israel in southern Lebanon. So right there, you're starting to see the undermining of the Western-backed Middle Eastern political order. And we'll see where this goes. I mean, I think if the United States winds up attacking land targets in Yemen, then we're going to see a full-on regional war, because Iran will more than likely get involved. From the West standpoint, the best thing would be for the Saudi Arabians and the other Gulf, oligarchies to start a war with the Houthis and make it an Arab contest rather than a Western versus Arab contest. But I'm not entirely sure that decision makers in Washington in particular are, that well versed on the dynamics of Middle Eastern politics and do not see anything other than that their power is being challenged. And if you take a look at the right-wing media in the United States, this is all about saving face. It's a bit of I don't want to say something vulgar, but it's basically, the United States has the biggest stick in the house, and if you come over and start flying drones at us, we'll show you that stick.
The other thing that's the complexity there that seems to be swaying, certainly giving a dimension to those that are opposing the United States' presence in this way, in the support of Israel's attacks on Gaza, for example. It seems to be the loss of the loss of a moral position, the moral leadership, the ethical leadership that comes with a country that believes it's the significant power around the world to settle things down in its own interests. And that's something that does not seem to be registering in the decision makers from my observations. Also, from the point of view of providing opportunity, and we touched on this in the previous 2 episodes that we did on Gaza conflict, Israel's disproportionate defensive attacks on Gaza and its peoples of all types, men, women, children, civilians, innocents, etc. So that in itself may look, in political science terms, I'll pose it as a question, Paul. Is that another indication of a declining power, not just from the point of view of political influence, but also on the position of moral leadership?
Oh, absolutely. And I should point out, we talked about the BRICS expanding. I mean, look, again, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Egypt, those are traditional American allies who have now decided to put some distance between themselves and the United States by joining the BRICS. This is very significant, again, because they're resource rich and that sort of thing. And so you're seeing a break, you're seeing a fracturing of these traditional post-World War II alliance systems. And part of it, and we'll touch on this in a few moments, is the decline of democracy in the West, and in particular the United States. Again, the comment you made a few months ago still resonates with me to this day, which is, if you look at it from afar, the United States is an unstable polity. It's not a guarantee of anything at this point.
It's not a reliable partner in a security sense for independently positioned countries, New Zealand included amongst those, to sign up to forward-committing alliances. And in that space, I think illustrates exactly what you're just mentioning there.
Exactly. And it'll be interesting for those of us, down in the South Pacific to see how this whole AUKUS, transition to nuclear submarines in Australia, how that works out.
There was
Again,
significant statements by the current United Kingdom, the government of the United Kingdom, in presence down in Perth only a matter of a week ago, where they were addressing the Australian ministerial counterparts on exactly AUKUS and advancing the nuclear bases that they have planned under the AUKUS umbrella in Western Australia, in Fremantle, etc. And also the British offering their expertise in such areas to the Australians, so that the Australians don't mark time on anything and don't have to learn like the United Kingdom experts in the nuclear industry have. So there's an advancement, a sense of presence that's really going for it in this way. At the same time, countries like New Zealand saying, well, we've got a new government here, we've got time to see where it responds with respect to AUKUS, and it may be one where it joins. But the popular the Kiwi street, if we put it in that way, seems to be well and truly one of let's keep well away from this thing. We're close enough as it is with our Five Eyes security networks, intelligence networks. Just on the point, sorry, I'm jumping around here a bit too, Paul, but I wanted to kind of get in on that part where you're talking about China setting up signals intelligence on, the South American continent, getting close to the United States. Obviously, its interest monitoring that. I'm kind of thinking, wow, the Chinese have been studying NATO. They've been studying the South Pacific. They've been studying what the French does in French Polynesia in the South Pacific, the footprints of global powers or region, significant powers, and how they go about it. And maybe the Chinese are saying, hey, we've got really close trading allies, including Australia and New Zealand, where we know that their security antennae are pointed our way, trying to make sure they know what we're up to before we do it on their own lands. Perhaps it's time for the United States to get used to that kind of thing too with its friends in South America. Kind of trying to give a sense in a crude way, obviously, being the end of 2023, of perhaps where the Chinese and People's Republic of China is viewing such things too, and balancing that other side of the global dominance of another power that is certainly rising fast.
right. I mean, all of this, shows that what we've been talking about for quite a while about the transition to multipolarity and what have you. Well, China is doing what an emerging great power has to do in order to stake its position in global affairs. And so building signals intelligence stations in South America is just part of that overall program of ascent to greatness. The United States can't do anything about it other than, stand on the porch and bark. I mean, it's not going to go to war with China or anyone else over these signals intelligence stations, in part because it has signals intelligence stations all over the world. And so, although it's been very hypocritical in its one-sided support for Israel, it's not going to extend that hypocrisy, throughout the world, fighting little wars to keep the Chinese offshore.
Exactly. You mentioned Israel there. Should we connect to Israel and the United States' positions on that, what you were seeing as the strengths, weaknesses, and otherwise, and place obviously concerns for the impact on Gaza, its livelihoods, its ability to sustain its position, and also human rights elements of this, the legal, if you wish, and also then we'll get into whether or not what's happening with the Ukraine thing. We can see, the Russian operation basically grinding Ukraine down at the same time while the interest in the United States Congress is waning. So if we get a context on that, and then we'll move toward evaluating the political environment 2024 as to what we've seen as a beginning here in some of the elections like Argentina and New Zealand. How's that? All right?
Yeah, okay. So let's as I said, the two precipitants for now the full emergence of the global South as a power contender to the North are the Russo-Ukrainian war and Hamas and Israel. The thing with Ukraine is interesting because the concern was that Russia would overrun Ukraine. That was the initial concern. That didn't happen. The Russians made a lot of mistakes. The Ukrainian turns out are much, fiercer than the Russians anticipated. But the Russians learned from their mistakes. The sanctions regime has not worked. Financially, it's put some pain on the Russians, but not enough to sap their will to keep the fight. And there's a pipeline of weapons and whatnot going into Russia from China, from Iran. I mean, those drones that the Russians are using are mostly Iranian drones. So they're there to stay. I mean, they're going to try to claim all of eastern Ukraine, bog the war down. It's a war, an old-fashioned war of attrition at this point. But most importantly, they're going to bog it down to wait until the consensus in the West fractures on the support for Ukraine, and it already is, both in Europe, within NATO, but certainly within the EU, and then in the United States. There are now large factions who think that the Ukrainians should just have to fend for themselves, that there are more pressing issues for the United States. I mean, they're trying to tie money up for border control as part of a spending package for Ukraine and Israel, as it turns out. So the Russians have the advantage here.
I see some interesting stuff, information being seeded out as well, with respect to where Russia is with this. That the Ukrainians are in a position where if they don't get the Western support, we understand that they won't be able to withhold the positions that they've got, and retreat may be an option of sustaining borders. There's the other thing that seems to be seeding out from the United States think tanks in some capacity, which is suggesting that it may be now important for Ukraine to have a rethink of what success looks like. And it may be west of the Dnipro River. It may be giving up the idea of retaking Crimea. That gives a sense of ability for the Putin regime and the Kremlin to claim a win, if they so wish to. And tied and dovetailed onto that kind of seeding of information at the moment seems to be this thing where if Putin does succeed in taking Ukraine, the question remains open as to whether or not that is the end of a territorial conflict. So just wanted to add in some of the things that have been discussed globally amongst those that are watching these things too, Paul.
Yeah, I think that the frontline states in Western Europe, let's say Poland, they are going to back Ukraine to the hilt because they believe they're next on Russia's hit list. And with Putin, with some of his actions, you don't know where he's going to stop. I mean, this whole idea of recapturing the days of empire and whatnot, you got to take him at his word. I mean, he's, nothing but if not transparent about his ambitions. Now, my hunch is that next year will be the make or break year. I happen to, just because of my life, I happen to have friends in Tucson, Arizona, where Ukrainian pilots are being trained on F-16s. It just happens that the Arizona Air National Guard has its main base at Tucson International Airport, has a military side to it. And that's where the Air National Guard operates their F-16s. And so it turns out there's a bunch of Ukrainian pilots living it up in Tucson. But they're only a couple months away from finishing their training. And the planes are on their way as well. I have a feeling that you're going to see an uptick in heavy Western weapons being delivered to the Ukraine with the idea that they can make a difference and shift the battle back onto the Russians. That is, put them on their heels and maybe drive them out, certainly of eastern Ukraine. And I think that's what a lot of the Western military strategists are planning for, a big push.
One of the interesting things there too, just as a quick side note, is, we saw a couple of months ago in 2023, we saw Ukraine in various ways, with drones largely striking targets, albeit significant military and perhaps legitimate targets inside Russian territory. That seemed to be a precursor, whether or not it was connected, but it was certainly on a timeline. We noticed dissatisfaction in the United States starting to grow politically with the sustaining effort of providing weapons and things. That seems to have eased off of late, and I'm wondering whether or not there has been discussions as to how heavy military equipment such as F-16s would be deployed and used, and whether or not cross-border missions would be tolerated by the West in such ways. And when I say the West, I mean obviously the United States.
Well, I think that the Russians have gotten better in their defensive countermeasures against drones. I don't think it's for lack of trying that the Ukrainians haven't been striking inside of Russia. I think the Russians have just gotten much more effective at defending against them. I would imagine the F-16s will be used over Ukrainian territory, that the Western partners will urge Ukraine to exercise extreme restraint when it comes to overflying Russian territory. In part to make the point to the Russians that this is just about regaining Ukrainian territory, not about taking Russian.
Yeah. You picked up exactly where I was going with that one. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it brings up the issue of Crimea. There really now is a big strategic divide, and to be honest with you, I'm not sure where I stand on this. On the one hand, there are people seriously believe that Crimea should be the objective for the Ukrainians, that if you cut Crimea off from eastern Ukraine, it literally the Russians will wither and die. I mean, they just will not have the supply lines that they currently have. And of course, the Russians have said that any attack on Crimea will be considered an attack on Russia itself, thereby raising the stakes. But, again, strategists believe they should call the Russian bluff because, in part, Crimeans are not as nationalistic as a whole when it comes to their loyalties to Russia. I mean, it's very divided as to where their loyalties lie. And they're suffering a lot because Crimea is a tourist-oriented economy. Obviously, none of that's happening right now. And they're taking fairly severe hits, particularly their maritime infrastructure, where the Ukrainians do have an advantage. The Ukrainians are doing well at sea, using seaborne drones, and they're
controlling Odessa in recent weeks.
Yeah, they've forced the Russians, out of stationing boats in Crimea and back onto Russian ports, in part because of the effectiveness of the Ukrainian Navy, such as it is. Now, others will say, no, if you go into Crimea, it's going to give the Russians an excuse to escalate this in a major way. And we do have to remember that, the Russians have a population of available military-age men that is tenfold larger than that of the Ukraine. The Ukraine literally are running out of bodies to put on the front lines, and so whereas the Russians can just use cannon fodder endlessly, and so opinions are very divided on to whether or not to try to take Ukraine.
One of the things on. Sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say, although I'm undecided about what the best course of action is, my normal nature is to urge caution and prudence in these sort of events, and so I'm thinking I don't know if taking Crimea or trying to take Crimea is a very good idea. Maybe just trying to regain the initiative in eastern Ukraine might be the better option, but it's certainly on the table. I mean,
with those generations that are perhaps older, the grandparent generation, the elder part of the parent generations inside Russia it would appear, seem to believe that the Crimea issue is one where it's been put correctly and right back for them, in a sense. So it may be like we can see in perhaps the Asia Pacific, where borders were marked out post-conflict or post-colonial interests, and those border conflicts continue to today. And I'm thinking Solomon Islands, I'm thinking Bougainville, Papua New Guinea, even West Papua, et cetera, have kind of connections to that kind of idea. With the part of the sustaining the Russian effort of having people on the front line, there are many things. Wagner's gone in a sense of what Wagner once was, with its leader Prigozhin and other leaders been wiped out, of course, by the Kremlin, one would suspect. But at the same time, those private armies are still able to access human beings from prisons who see this as perhaps a way out of the cell. But most importantly, we see the efforts of the Kremlin, where it is recruiting soldiers for this conflict in the deeper regions of Russia, where for the first time those males and their families are able to bring an income in. And these are, conscription soldiers. So being able to bring an income into their families, of which they would never been able to in the past or believe that they could in the future. Beyond that, they know that that salary is going back directly to their families. Secondly, if they get killed on the front line, they have an assurance by the Kremlin that their children have right, irrespective of academic record, into the Russian universities, and for their fees and etc. to be paid for. Also, there's a degree of paying those salaries post-death for a period of time as well, of which I'm not sure on the concluding dates on that. But those are the kind of efforts that are being made, and the investments in the war machine to make sure that they've got more and more soldiers on the front line. And that will not be left out of the discussion points, no doubt, of those strategists and those that from the Ukrainian side in the West that are trying to assess what does sustainability in this conflict look like.
Right. I guess the bottom line is that Putin and the Kremlin have regained the initiative, both domestically as well as diplomatically. Let's remember Putin was just welcomed to Saudi Arabia and the UAE. They rolled out the red carpet for him, 3 weeks ago.
They didn't send him packing to The Hague.
No, not at all. It goes to show you the limits of The Hague and the extradition treaty. Although I should point out that Saudi Arabians have never signed up to the ICC. So the issue is that right now Russia has the initiative. Russia can afford a war of attrition. You just mentioned why. Domestically, the sanctions regime is not really punishing Russia in the way that it could, because most countries in the world are not adhering to it. And Putin has diplomatic support. Putin has, it's very clear the way he was welcomed in the Middle East, in the middle of the Hamas-Israel war and the Russo-Ukrainian war, that, he's still among friends in many places in the world. So the Ukrainians have to make hay. And I say that because 2024 will be a make or break. And let's remember that 2024 is an election year in the United States. Things are all bound up now in the election, because things are going to start heating up right after the beginning of the year. First primary.
Colorado made a preemptive strike on the Trump efforts.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see. They'll fast track to the Supreme Court, I'm sure, and see how the ruling is. It's interesting in that, he clearly incited an insurrection. Now, since he hasn't been convicted of that, the question is, was it constitutional for the Colorado Supreme Court to rule against him? I have a feeling he's going to be put back on the ballot because he hasn't been convicted of the crime. Apparently, his trial for inciting the insurrection starts on March 4th, which is the week before the primary season gets going. So, he'll probably skate on this one yet again. But the whole election year is going to be driven by a lot of things, but a couple of them will be Ukraine and Israel. Where to go with this.
And now, I think a lot of the attention in the West will be focusing more than perhaps ever in history on Congress as well. that because of this external kind of ability for the United States to sustain or not sustain particular things. So back to you, because I know you're going to pick up on the Gaza-Israel thing.
Yeah. And so, I mean, things have gotten very strange in the Republican Party. I mean, you've actually got a full-on conspiracy theorist running. You've got people parroting Trump lines. Trump now is using Hitler's language to describe, undocumented migrants. What the poisoning our blood references and whatnot. So things have gotten really weird. And again, all interested observers have to be concerned about the direction of the United States, especially if the Republicans keep the congressional majority and any Republican, Trump or not, comes into office, because they're sort of beholden to that MAGA faction, whether or not they hold the majority in Congress. Now, that brings up the issue of Hamas and Israel. To my mind, as we've spoken about before, Hamas may be losing the battle, but is winning the war. And by that, what I mean is, and as we said before, much like 9/11, the day after 9/11, everybody was, the United States, they've been attacked, this, that, and the other. And the United States managed to squander all that goodwill by invading Iraq, and involving itself in unnecessary conflicts. Israel's done the same thing. Israel, which, is open about using collective punishment as retribution for any attacks, have really overdone it, to the point that not only is the global South against Israel. See, the global South sees Israel as a post-colonial relic, as an imposition of the West after World War II on the natives, indigenous people of the Levant, i.e. Palestinians. Now, I'm not going to get into the historical record. Jews have been in that region for 2,000 years. There's others can argue about that. The issue here is that Hamas is winning in the court of world opinion. And I shouldn't say, see, I'm doing it too. I'm saying Hamas, they're the tacticians. Palestinians are winning in the court of world opinion. I should, make the difference very clear. Mm-hmm. And what's interesting about that, it's not just in the Middle East, of course, they would support the Palestinians, although the oligarchs do not. And there's a whole sidebar about why Palestinians are not supported by other Arab leaders. It sort of strikes me that they're treated much like the Kurds are treated. No one wants to borrow them. No one wants them to have a truly independent state. But certainly in terms of world opinion, I would argue the best attempts by the pro-Israel lobby in the United States and New Zealand notwithstanding, most people on the street are pro-Palestinian. They're the underdogs. They're being bullied viciously by Israel.
Slaughtered irrespective of their age, genders.
Exactly. I mean, it's just people do not appreciate the collective punishment of innocence in order for Israel to make a point about what the extent to which it will go in order to maintain its supremacy.
And my position on this is very clear too, and I've always felt very supportive in this way from you, Paul, is you look at these things, so you very easily can get drawn into a bias of one side or the other in favour of. My point is here, and is, with a view from afar, we've seeded this out, stated it out very clearly, that when it comes to what's happening in Israel and what's happened in Gaza and is happening in Gaza, we look at it from the point of view of universal human rights and also international, if there was an ideal of universal justice and recourse to justice for crimes committed. And that's why you'll hear us being very hard on the state of Israel, the government of Israel, not being anti-Semitic in any way for those that may feel that that's the case. What we're doing is taking a stand that we all bleed, we're all human, When we see our fellow human beings being under attack disproportionately by a power of which cannot be resisted or defended upon, then we start to speak in such terms. Paul, I just wanted to put that out there because at this point, some people may be thinking, right, these guys, we're going to take it to them. And this is our position, and that's one that we'll never back away from. I think we're talking very one as a team on that one, I hope.
Yeah, I mean, if people want to, say that you and I are anti-Semites, go for it. It's water off my back. The deal is this. I'll reiterate it because it's worth keeping in mind. Both sides are guilty of crimes against humanity and war crimes, and particularly in the case of Israel. As I've said before, it's not the instrument of injury that matters, so, be it a bomb or a knife or whatnot. It is who is targeted. And that's the bottom line definition of what constitutes a war crime. When you target non-combatant civilians for any reason, you're committing a war crime. And the numbers, you could get into the scale, but numbers don't matter as much as who, because war crimes can be committed, against one person or a small group, let's say a village in Afghanistan. And now we're seeing, particularly on the side of Israel, war crimes being committed on industrial scale. But the dominant position of, at least of the corporate media, it seems to me, is to try to get you to choose a side. And I'll give you an example of how this bias, if you will, can play itself out in seemingly innocuous ways. Last week, the Israeli army killed 3 hostages who were attempting to surrender to them.
Israeli citizens,
Right. So there were Israeli citizens trying to, surrender to their own troops, and they got shot dead trying to do so. Now, the
waving
focus
a white flag.
Well, that's where I'm going. The focus of attention was on, friendly fire. The Israeli soldiers made a mistake. They're now blaming it on one soldier who got scared and decided to, kill them all. 2 things come out of this. The first one is that there were 2 Palestinians in the vicinity of the guys trying to surrender. They were shot dead as well. 5 people were killed. No one mentions the Palestinians, who had nothing to do with Hamas. They were just walking by. The second one is that a war crime was committed. They were surrendering. They had a white flag, a white piece of cloth. Under the Geneva Convention, they need to be taken prisoner alive. Then you sort out who they are.
Yeah, the issue of duty to care is well and truly established in international humanitarian law, et cetera, et cetera.
But, the coverage is all about, this was a mistake. This is terrible. This is what happens when, hostages are held. The bigger issue is Israeli soldiers fired on people attempting to surrender. Okay? That's, it's a war crime. I mean, it's as stark as you can get. And yet no one's talking about that. No one has anything to say. And here in New Zealand, as well as in the United States, a lot of us who are trying to, not understand both sides of the story, but are looking forward to a solution rather than recriminations about what's been in the past, we're getting squeezed. And I see it particular. I have a number of Jewish friends in the States. They are all progressive Jews. They're not conservative. They're not Zionists. People I've met in my university career and whatnot, they're in the worst position of all because they're Jewish. And yet they don't support what Israel's doing in the measure that it's doing, right to defend itself and all that, sure. But this has gone way beyond that. And so I think what's going to be interesting is that with the emergence of, or with the expansion of the BRICS into Saudi Arabia and the UAE, with the emergence of this global South bloc in the making, the United States is going to get squeezed to turn off the spigot on Israel. And that's going to become a major election issue. Very bad news for Joe Biden. since he's backed Israel, and they are basically ignoring his pleas for moderation. And so the pressure on Israel will not come necessarily from the United States, but it may come from elsewhere. Israel, does live in a community of nations. It had been reaching out to establish normal relations with the Sunni Arab world because of the common threat posed by Iran. And all of that is in disarray now. So if they want to get back on track, they're going to have to, start phasing down this war. Now, as I've said before, the only way this cycle of violence is going to slow down, I'm not saying it's going to end anytime soon, is Israel's going to have to start giving back Palestinian land in the West Bank as well as elsewhere. And given the amount of settlers that have taken over the lands, and given the fact that they are very orthodox, ultra conservative, and they are armed, that is going to be an extremely difficult thing to do on the Israelis' part, even if they wanted to do that.
I would add that the United States could assist that particular principle by ceasing to veto, since in the early 1970s it has done, on putting recourse back or addressing the illegalities of the settlements that exist in the northern part and the Golan Heights, etc., etc. So having signals coming from the United States on such things, where it no longer will veto attempts to put things right, would certainly be something toward a more stable Middle East, and perhaps a track and a pathway to such things. Paul, this whole thing, I'll just read a couple of comments that have come in on this, and then pass it back to you to talk about the what we observed with the decline of Western democracies, particularly from the point of view of a right-wing turn at the ballot boxes in a couple of significant countries in the last month or two. So I'll just bring up on screen a couple of the comments that have come in, and thank you to people who have done so. Donna Marie Lawson, a great woman here, and she has put in, it's quite a long one. I'll read the first paragraph or so you can, people listening to this can hear it. For those that are watching, it's up on screen as we talk. And Donna says, I do not think so. What she's talking about here is Saudi Arabia is only just now, after over a year in negotiations with the Houthis regarding a withdrawal from Yemen. This means Yemen return to Yemen, and the onus falls to them to form a peace treaty with the different factions. Yemen is problematic insofar as, unlike the monarchy-based countries, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, UAE, etc., which are all US supported, Yemen is not in this position. So, Paul, you saw the comment there. If you wish to address it, we can do. Donna has also just put up, and I'll bring it on point. She says here, for me, this has been been personal since childhood. My mum, she's talking about the conflicts in general. My mum dragged me off to hear Vanessa Redgrave speak about Palestine in Sandringham, Auckland in the very late 1970s. I first went to that part of the world in the very 1990s, and have either of you read Anthony Lawrenston's book, Yes, The Palestinian Laboratory, How Israel Exports the Technology of Occupation Around the World? Yes, Donna, certainly have, and Anthony has been well rewarded from the point of view of awards and recognition, and also being one of that connects to Judaism as one who has a powerful voice in humanitarian interests, I think. But Paul, I've just put those up and I've just read from them. If you wish to comment on those, and we know the end of our trajectory is coming for the last program in 2023, and we're going to be talking about the decline of Western democracies and a rightward turn in many places, including Argentina and New Zealand. Then we'll wrap it up, Paul.
Well, yeah, I'll just say that yet again, the conflict involving the factions in Yemen has to be solved by Arabs themselves. The less the United States involves itself is probably for the best. The trouble is that Iran is there, and again, it's part of the trouble of being the Leviathan, is that you see everything as a challenge to your honor. And so the United States feels it cannot let Iran get away, and then you can just do an alphabet soup of things the United States doesn't think Iran should be allowed to get away with, one of which is its support for the Houthis. I tend to think this is something that the Arabs should settle amongst themselves. That if the United States gets involved, it's going to it's going to make things worse because right now, the Hamas Israel war is causing instability in the Sunni Arab world because the streets are restive. They see their leaders catering to Israel implicitly or explicitly. They see they're saying nothing. I mean, Egypt has not opened its doors to refugees. It's causing instability, albeit hidden at the moment, in these autocracies. And so the last thing they need is for the United States to get involved on a second front against the Houthis, which will, very likely drag Iran in, even if Iran uses proxies to wage war on the United States. And so, coming from Latin America, I just refer to my own historical past. The less the United States involved, probably the better it is for everybody in the areas in which it's trying to get involved. The only place where the United States can make a significant difference is in Israeli policy making circles, and right now they're not listening. They're the tail that wags the dog. Now let me turn to the issues of democracy, and there's a big trend, and then this rightward drift. The big trend is this: liberal democracies are collapsing of their own accord. This is where Putin has read the liberal democratic world as weak and ineffectual. We're arguing about culture wars and that sort of nonsense when in fact there are greater threats, in my opinion, to these democracies. I think that their economic foundations are under siege because they're attached to capitalist models that no longer serve the public interest in many instances. And so you would say that it's democratic sclerosis that is the malaise of the day. And we see it around the world. The United States, of course, is the absolute epitome of that. And the trend for the foreseeable future is not only that, sort of a decline of governance in democracies, but then there's this rightward tilt. And the rightward tilt is, let's be honest, it's a tilt towards authoritarianism. And, we could go down all the polls that show that, anywhere between 40 to 50% of the populations in most democracies do not think democracy is the best form of government. They'll take something else, but they just have no faith in democracy, including places like the United States. New Zealand happens to be slightly better on that, but it's not as if we get 90% of New Zealanders thinking democracy is the best possible form of governance.
We get an abandonment of people turning up to the polls. And I know all Western democracies are suffering the same thing, but there's a significant non-vote in New Zealand, which is a vote in itself in many respects. So I don't know about the Argentinian counterparts in this respect, but you will.
Yeah. It's one of those things where I don't know whether to laugh or cry about my beloved Argentina. But it in a weird way, there's parallels between the election of Javier Milei in Argentina and this change of government here to the coalition of chaos. And it's this: Argentines voted for this. He calls himself an anarcho-capitalist, tantric sex guru on top of everything else, who takes political advice from his 5 cloned mastiffs. Who he's named after libertarian economists. The guy's a nutcase. But the vote was a protest vote against the political establishment, politics as usual.
And that's a common issue, isn't it? This vote for the change. We want change. How do we express that wish?
And the deal in Argentina, it was the youth, people under 30, between 18 and 30, that propelled Milei into office. Now, this is going to be a disaster. the guy has no experience governing. He was a one-term representative in the Argentine Congress, so he had been in office for 2 years. He's proposing to kill off the central bank, dollarize the economy. Anyway, it's insanity
and
on
it's far
steroids.
from me to assess, but he does not seem to be some sort of sex guru to me. Lacking in that particular X factor. I know Donna Marie Lawson, I'll bring it up because she won't mind. I'll bring it up on thing, and Donna Marie says with tongue in cheek here, wow, a sex god, with reference to the Argentinian new
Yeah, you guys got to cut it out because I'll never get that image out of my head. Okay, let's just stop there. But here's the thing: where do I see the parallel? Not on that subject. But New Zealanders have this, and again, I'm a naturalized New Zealander. But one thing that struck me since the day I got here in 1997 is New Zealanders will vote for change just for change. They'll allow a government to last about 6 years, so 2 terms. But whether the government is doing good or not, whether the government has initiative or is exhausted, New Zealanders just vote for change.
It's something that, Alistair Campbell, Tony Blair's former press secretary, has a podcast out regularly. The Rest is Just Politics with Rory the Tory, went for the leadership of the Tory party. It's a fantastic podcast. And they make mention that they're seeing trends in the European Union where incumbents can expect 2 terms, no more. That trend seems to be narrowing down. That's an interesting thing. So you're talking, in the six-year thing, 2 terms in the New Zealand context is 6 years. Beyond that, they're struggling. But we saw that even with ones that got over the line, like the Helen Clark government, very strong and many would argue a very effective government, particularly for those that were perhaps centre-left in their persuasions. Those strengths of what put them into office, like in Helen Clark's case, a strong leader, knows a governance, knows her policies, knows her party, knows the country very well, but strong leadership. That turns by the end of it to being, control freak, we don't want this person in our lives. We're calling the capital Helengrad from here on, and those very qualities are seen as negatives. We saw it the same in the right with John Key, going from he's the kind of person you have around a barbecue for a beer and enjoy social time with, but by the end of it for John Key, he resigned before an election, but was creepy old Uncle John, he's far too familiar type of attitude to those strengths that he was once perceived to have. It's interesting, isn't it, this vote for change, and you saw it in Argentina, Paul. You see that as the common thread in this kind of thing, and that sway toward authoritarianism.
Exactly. What I see is that here in New Zealand as well as in Argentina, people voted for change's sake. And they spent a lot less time listening to what, let's say in Malay's case, this guy's got a very strong authoritarian streak. I mean, he's got this messianic streak as well, admires Donald Trump. He wants to roll back abortion rights, gay rights. For a so-called libertarian, that's a bit of a contradiction. But here we've got a little bit of the same. If you think about the campaigns, basically, this new coalition ran on sort of the tired right-wing memes of too much crime, too high taxes, not enough housing. That's it. But they had a secret agenda, which is to roll back pretty much every progressive policy implemented by the previous government.
And I would argue back to the end of the 1990s when their ideologues were last in power. I would say that the small government footprint ideologues are well and truly in control of the strategic agenda here, and that in 2024, by this time in 2024, may be very squarely in evidence in the New Zealand context. That's my prediction for next year in the New Zealand politic. But, Paul, back to you, because this is really something of an idea that can be exported to those listeners from other countries abroad of what we've witnessed in the southern hemisphere with Argentina and New Zealand. One would suspect that on the basis of a want for change and a tolerance toward authoritarianism, that the ingredients, all the recipe is there for similar things to happen at the ballot box in so-called Western democracies. And that perhaps is a big threat to those that are hoping that sanity will prevail in the United States as it approaches election proper in 2024.
Right. I mean, you make a very good point. These are not the lessons that I would have hoped would have been learned in order to recover the dynamism of democracy. What we're doing is this tilt towards authoritarianism. And you see it, for example, in New Zealand, there basically was a secret agenda underpinning this coalition that has now come into office. They didn't campaign on rolling back the fair pay agreement, the clean car emission scheme, all these things. They didn't really campaign on that. They did the old, again, the old right-wing memes about crime and stuff. But now they're doing it, and they're doing it not by consultation. They're doing it under urgency with their simple majority in parliament. They're just repealing everything, a razor gang, to use an old phrase. That, unfortunately, in the absence of a critical media that asks hard questions about, well, what do you really intend? I mean, you talk about ram raids, but, what exactly do you propose to do? Knowing that ram raids are a symptom, right? Not the cause of a problem. None of that happened here. In Argentina, the media was fascinated on the freak show that is this guy. And so they didn't really get into the contradictions in his policy approaches. And I fear that because the corporate media has gone clickbait crazy, and are looking at each other when they're, trying to get eyeballs and whatnot, that the lack of critical scrutiny on election campaigns and on candidates will lead to a deepening of this right-wing drift into outright what we in the comparative politics literature call hard democracies. In Spanish, they have this wonderful phrase, democracia is democracy. But there is a phrase called democradura, which means demos, occur as in democracy, but duro or dura mean hard. So democradura is a hard democracy where restrictions on certain civil liberties, restrictions on the freedom of the press, those sort of things are implemented often by stealth, by quiet changes to legislation, and before you know it, you're not living in a democracy anymore. That I fear is what's going on here in New Zealand. I have no doubt that Malay's going to try this in Argentina. The thing is, Argentina has a violent political culture. By that I mean a culture of street protests where they really take it to the riot squad. They don't sit back and allow the cops to beat on them. They fight back. I was raised in that atmosphere. I learned my politics initially in that atmosphere. It's very different than New Zealand, which has a very passive population, which does not fight back in the measure that Argentines do. But I have a feeling that led by Maori, because Maori now are being attacked, in essential ways, their language, the very treaty that binds us as a nation is now under siege, that led by Maori, New Zealanders may have to fight back in order to reclaim the liberal part of democracy in the face of this onslaught where you've got basically two populists of different types bookending a semi-centrist right-winger who is way out of his depth when it comes to politics. The other two bookends are far better political operators than the guy in the middle. And so I think that we may be symptomatic. New Zealand's always been a laboratory rat for, marketers and those sort of things, neoliberalism. We were one of the laboratory rats for that. I have a feeling that we're going to become the laboratory rat for a new type if you will, it's neoliberalism, a rehash of the 1980s. And again, I use that phrase razor gang on purpose because the prescriptions that they're offering not only are a throwback, but by and large have been discredited throughout the world. These orientation of the focus on tax cutting, the focus on reducing the size of the state. If anything we learned from the pandemic is sometimes you need the state. The state is there for the common weal.
And we saw some of the most committed neoliberal democracies around the country, around the world, excuse me, embracing interventionism during the COVID years through necessity, both economic and socially. So, that underscores and accentuates your point on that. I think in the New Zealand context, one of my fears is, excuse me, I've got a bit of a thing going here, is very simply that it appears at this onslaught of erasing any co-governance principles of which New Zealand is founded on, that the current incumbents are expressing themselves in a new colonial type of a way, and the colonisation of the indigenous culture seems to be the imperative that they're seeking, driving ahead with this. That's one of my main concerns, because there will be no surprises at all that will be resisted extremely heavily. And in a New Zealand context, that will be not just a blip on the timeline radar, it will be a huge spike. And that perhaps is something that the centre person in this coalition government in New Zealand, Luxon, needs to be very mindful of, and one would hope that he has those sensitivities in existence to be able to avoid such things. The other things is inside the national governing, national-led coalition party here, is the factions within that are divided, and that's its weak tripline. That those in excess of libertarian ideals, economically or otherwise, like the end-of-life bills and things like that, do not sit well. There is no common ground with those that are also by large faction inside the National Party. That's something to watch in 2024, I think, too, Paul. Paul, let's wrap it up. We've just got a good comment. This is a pat on the back for you, Paul. I'll bring it up on screen from Donna Marie Lawson, who added to the episode just a matter of minutes ago. And Donna Marie says, "Thank you, Paul. You guys are the only in-depth analysis in Aotearoa. Thank you so much. I wish you both a great summer break. Thank you again." Now, that is a bit of a pat on the back, Paul, so I just thought I'd add that because it's been a long, hard
cheers,
day.
Donna.
Yeah,
I appreciate that.
Paul. Yeah,
okay, we'll
let you wrap up and we'll say goodbye.
Yeah, okay. Well, I have a feeling that neither one of these governments, Malay or the Luxon-led government, are going to last 6 months unless they really change their course. And the thought I have for New Zealand is one of anxiety, because just like Trump ripped the scab off of all racists and bigots in the United States, it appears this coalition has done the same thing. And its attacks on Maori, and again on Maori as as an entity, if you will. What I've seen, and especially in the right-wing oriented media and social media, is the racists have come out of the closet. I mean, here in New Zealand. And it's scary, because I have a feeling as Maori go about defending their rights, we're going to see violence. I think that genie was popped out of the bottle last March with the protests down in Wellington. And I don't think that genie's getting put back in under this government, because, in fact, certainly the ACT Party and its leader, David Seymour, are dog whistling to that very same crowd. And then the other bookend, Winston Peters, he's gone full conspiracy theorist, QAnon type, and is stirring that crowd up. And so I see no good coming of this, and I don't see the centrist Luxon as being able to handle either one of them, much less two at once. So I don't see this thing holding, much in the way I don't think Malay, unless he changes course, can possibly govern. He has no support in Congress. And if he resorts to executive decrees, because Argentina is a presidential democracy as opposed to our parliamentary democracy, if he starts resorting to executive decrees, which is allowable in presidential systems, there'll be riots in the streets. He's proposing to lay off 100,000 public servants, change labor laws to weaken unions. We've been through that here. The Argentines aren't going to put up with that. In conclusion, not the rosiest of pictures as we look into the new year, but on the other hand, maybe the worst is over in terms of seeing these shifts, and we're now being able to see a resistance being built up to this creeping authoritarianism that we see in the liberal democratic world. And that in turn, especially if we acknowledge historical mistakes, may allow for a better balance with the global South. See, the global North has to take stock of its sins before it can, legitimately and honestly engage with the global South. And that's why I say both Ukraine and Russia, as well as Hamas and Israel, are going to be the lightning rods for whether, the liberal democratic world can do that. And it remains to be seen, but I'm sufficiently optimistic that we've seen the worst of the likes of Trump and Bolsonaro and those sort of guys. As for the audience itself, thanks a lot for being with us this year, and hopefully we'll reconvene next year, and it'll be a better one.
Yeah, thank you for that, Paul. Thanks for your company over the months of this year. As with previous years with the episodes of A View from Afar, it's always been an absolute pleasure. Look forward to 2024, Paul, and thank you to the audience too for being with us. We know that there's some of you that really value this. We encourage you to always spread that love as far as you can, and with those that wish to hear it. But the main point is let's try and actually establish peace in our conversations and our relationships with other people. That's obviously a really important and sometimes challenging thing to do. But if we can get our homes perhaps more in order, then we perhaps can show that there is hope for the bigger pictures as well. That doesn't undermine or put a Pollyanna-ish type of spin on the challenges that we face globally and domestically. But at least in some ways it gives us a little bit of hope for the future, and looking to those younger generations, some of them are just amazing. So with all of that, thank you for 2023 and sticking with us with the episode. Once again, take care out there, be safe in whatever language peace means in your dialect, let it be expressed. Until we see you again, ka kite anō, take care out there. Goodbye from Paul and I.